I'll tell you something right now. Washington, D.C. is the most powerful small city on Earth, a planned capital built from scratch on swampy Potomac riverbank that now makes decisions affecting every human being alive, operates the largest collection of free museums in the world, and has been the stage for every defining moment in American history since the country decided it needed a place to put its government and its ambitions simultaneously. This is 68 square miles of monuments, marble, and machinery where the American experiment is conducted daily in public, and the results have never once been predictable. Number 25. A French engineer designed the entire city. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French-born engineer who served in the Continental Army and developed an obsessive vision for what an American capital should look like, was appointed by George Washington in 1791 to design the new city from scratch, producing a plan of diagonal avenues overlaid on a grid, radiating from the Capitol and the President's house in spoke patterns that created the sight lines, the ceremonial spaces, and the traffic patterns that Washington, D.C. still operates within today. L'Enfant was fired before the city was completed because he demolished the house of a prominent landowner that was blocking one of his planned avenues without asking permission, which is the kind of professional miscalculation that suggests a man more committed to the plan than to the people who had to live with the consequences. Number 24. Washington, D.C. was built on contested swampland. The site selected for the capital, a diamond of land carved from Maryland and Virginia at the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, was chosen by George Washington, partly because it was near his Mount Vernon estate, a proximity that historians have been noting with diplomatic understatement ever since. The geography of the district, low-lying and humid, produces summers of such oppressive heat and moisture that the British Foreign Office once classified Washington as a hardship posting equivalent to tropical assignments, a designation that diplomats who arrived in August found entirely reasonable, and that Washington residents have been contradicting with cheerful denial for 2 centuries. Number 23. The Capitol Dome is not the original design. The United States Capitol building, whose dome is the most recognized symbol of American democracy worldwide, was under active construction, the original low dome being replaced with the massive cast-iron dome visible today. During the entire Civil War, a decision Abraham Lincoln defended on the grounds that completing the Capitol while the Union was fighting to preserve itself sent a message that the country intended to continue. The dome weighs nearly 9 million pounds and contains a fresco by Italian-born artist Constantino Brumidi called The Apotheosis of Washington, depicting George Washington ascending to godhood among Roman deities, which is a level of civic self-regard that even Washington, D.C., a city not known for excessive modesty, has occasionally had to explain to visitors. Number 22. The White House has been rebuilt from ashes. The White House, burned by British forces in August 1814 during the War of 1812 in a retaliatory raid that also destroyed the Capitol, was rebuilt so thoroughly that the fire's damage is visible today only in the smoke staining on the original sandstone walls, preserved beneath the white paint that gave the building its name, and that James Hoban, the original architect, applied during reconstruction. The building has been home to every American president except George Washington, contains 132 rooms across 6 floors, and receives approximately 100,000 visitors annually, a number that would be considerably higher if the security requirements that have progressively restricted access since the 1970s had not transformed the People's House into a building the people can see mainly from behind a fence. Number 21. The Smithsonian holds America's collective memory. The Smithsonian Institution, established in 1846 with a bequest from British scientist James Smithson, who never visited America and whose motivations for leaving his entire estate to a country he had never set foot in remain genuinely mysterious, has grown into the world's largest museum and research complex. 19 museums, 21 libraries, 9 research centers, and a zoo, all free to the public, containing 154 million artifacts, including the original Star-Spangled Banner, the Hope Diamond, Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Vega, and a moon rock you can touch. The Air and Space Museum on the National Mall is the most visited museum in the United States, which means that on any given summer afternoon, the history of human flight is being explained simultaneously to approximately 22,000 people sweating politely in a building that cannot be made adequately large for the demand it receives. Number 20. The Library of Congress contains everything ever printed. The Library of Congress, established in 1800 and rebuilt after the British burned its original collection in 1814, when Thomas Jefferson sold his personal library of 6,487 books to Congress as a replacement, a transaction Jefferson needed financially and the country needed intellectually, is now the largest library in the world, containing 173 million items in 470 languages across 3 buildings on Capitol Hill. The library's Great Hall in the Thomas Jefferson Building, completed in 1897 in an explosion of Italian Renaissance decoration so elaborate that it reads less like a library than like a civilization's attempt to build the most beautiful room it was capable of imagining, is one of the finest interiors in the United States and is visited by approximately nobody relative to how many people would be transformed by seeing it. Before we continue, if you're learning something new about Washington, D.C., hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It helps us keep exploring the hidden stories of every American city together. Number 19. The National Mall is the country's front yard. The National Mall, the 2-mile expanse of lawn, monuments, and reflecting pools stretching from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, was envisioned by L'Enfant as the ceremonial heart of the Republic and has functioned exactly as intended, hosting the March on Washington, Vietnam War protests, presidential inaugurations, and 4th of July celebrations, attended by hundreds of thousands of people who arrive at the same lawn with fundamentally different ideas about what the country it represents should become. The mall is technically a national park, managed by the National Park Service with a budget perpetually insufficient for the maintenance demands of 24 million annual visitors walking across grass that is simultaneously a civic symbol and a lawn, which means the turf is perpetually being restored, a Sisyphean landscaping obligation that the Park Service has been performing since the mall was completed. Number 18. Washington, D.C. has no voting representation in Congress. The approximately 700,000 residents of Washington, D.C., more people than the entire states of Wyoming or Vermont, pay full federal income taxes, serve in the military at rates comparable to any state, and have no voting representation in the United States Senate, and only a non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives, a situation the district's license plates describe with the phrase "taxation without representation," in a reference to the revolutionary grievance that the country was founded to correct and has not yet applied to its own capital. The D.C. statehood debate, which has been conducted continuously since 1801 with a consistency that suggests the argument has become as much a feature of Washington politics as a problem to be solved, involves constitutional questions, partisan calculations, and a genuine democratic deficit that the rest of the country discusses with considerably less urgency than the people most directly affected by it. Number 17. Georgetown predates the Capitol by decades. Georgetown, the neighborhood of Federal and Victorian row houses on the Potomac's northern bank that is now Washington, D.C.'s most expensive residential enclave and most visited commercial district, was an established tobacco port with its own charter, its own university, and its own sense of civic superiority before Washington, D.C. existed. Incorporated into the district in 1871 with a reluctance that Georgetown has been expressing architecturally ever since, by maintaining the distinct character of a town that predates its surroundings. Georgetown University, founded in 1789 by Bishop John Carroll as the first Catholic university in the United States, sits on a bluff above the Potomac and has educated a list of statesmen, diplomats, and political operatives whose collective influence on American foreign policy constitutes an informal alumni network that operates with more continuity than most presidential administrations. Number 16. The Metro opened and transformed the region. The Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority's Metro system opened in 1976 after a planning and construction process that lasted 15 years and required the most complex underground engineering project in mid-Atlantic American history, was designed from the beginning as a civic monument as much as a transit system. Its distinctive coffered concrete vaulted stations, designed by architect Harry Wees, creating a series of underground cathedrals that make the Washington Metro the most architecturally significant subway system in the United States and one of the most recognized in the world. The system connects the district to Maryland and Virginia suburbs across 130 stations and 117 miles of track, making it the second busiest heavy rail transit system in the country, and operates under a governance structure shared between the district and 2 states that makes the funding negotiations required to keep it running a textbook case in the difficulties of regional government. Number 15. Lincoln was killed in a theater 6 blocks from the White House. Ford's Theater on 10th Street Northwest, where John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln on the evening of April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. At what should have been the celebratory conclusion of the war Lincoln had spent 4 years fighting, is a functioning theater and a National Historic Site simultaneously, which means that audiences attend productions on the same stage where the most consequential assassination in American history occurred, seated in a building that the federal government closed for over a century after the shooting and reopened in 1968. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house owned by William Peterson, died in a rear bedroom at 7:22 the following morning, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly observed that Lincoln now belonged to the ages, a sentence so perfectly composed for the moment that historians have been debating ever since whether Stanton actually said it or whether someone in the room understood immediately that the line would need to be that good. Number 14. The Washington Monument was built in 2 stages. The Washington Monument, the 555-foot Egyptian obelisk dominating the center of the mall that is the tallest stone structure in the world and was the tallest structure of any kind on Earth when it was completed in 1884, was begun in 1848, halted in 1854 when the funding ran out and a nativist political organization briefly seized control of the project, and resumed in 1879 with stone from a slightly different Maryland quarry, meaning the color change visible approximately a third of the way up. The shaft is not a design choice, but a 30-year gap in construction, a seam in the marble that is also a seam in American history. The monument sank 11 inches into the mall's soft ground in the years after its completion, was stabilized, and now tilts approximately 1/10 of 1 degree from vertical, a deviation so minor that it is invisible to the naked eye, and mentioned mainly by guides who understand that a monument tilting almost imperceptibly toward the Capitol is the kind of detail that makes people look at a familiar object differently. Number 13. The March on Washington changed the country's direction. On August 28, 1963, approximately 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the largest political demonstration in American history to that point, and heard Martin Luther King Jr. deliver a speech that began as a prepared text about the broken promises of American democracy and pivoted, reportedly at the urging of gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who called out, "Tell them about the dream," into an improvised peroration that became the most recognized piece of American oratory since the Gettysburg Address. The marble step on the Lincoln Memorial where King stood is marked with a small inscription noting the location, a modest acknowledgement of a moment that produced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 within 2 years of the speech, a legislative consequence that gives the inscription beneath King's feet a weight that the stone it is cut into barely contains. Number 12. Watergate destroyed a presidency and named a scandal category. The Watergate complex on the Potomac, the office, hotel, and apartment development whose Democratic National Committee headquarters was burglarized by operatives connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign in June 1972, produced a constitutional crisis that resulted in Nixon's resignation in August 1974, the only resignation of an American president in history, after the release of tape recordings proved Nixon had participated in covering up the break-in within days of its occurrence. The suffix "gate" appended to every subsequent American political scandal is the lasting linguistic legacy of a burglary that Nixon's own advisors considered unnecessary, given that he was winning the 1972 election by the largest margin in modern political history, which suggests that the Watergate affair was a catastrophe produced not by political weakness, but by a paranoia so deeply embedded that it operated independently of the political reality it was responding to. Number 11. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial broke every design rule. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, designed by Yale architecture student Maya Lin as her submission to a national competition in 1981 and selected from 1,421 entries by a jury that did not know the designer's name, age, or background when it made its choice, was attacked before it was built by veterans groups and politicians who considered its design. 2 black granite walls descending into the earth at an angle, inscribed with the names of 58,279 Americans killed in the war, insufficiently heroic, insufficiently martial, and insufficiently American for a national memorial on the Mall. The memorial has since become the most visited site in Washington, D.C., and produced the most studied example of spontaneous memorial culture in the country. Visitors leaving objects at the base of the wall since its opening in 1982, a practice so consistent and so emotionally significant that the National Park Service has collected and preserved over 400,000 objects left at the wall, constituting an archive of American grief that no museum planned or anticipated. Number 10. Howard University is the capstone of Black intellectual life. Howard University, founded in 1867 in the years immediately following the Civil War and named for Oliver Otis Howard, the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau who helped establish it, is the most prominent historically Black university in the country, a research institution in Northwest Washington that has produced Thurgood Marshall, Toni Morrison, Kamala Harris, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and a roster of graduates whose contributions to American law, literature, politics, and culture constitute the most concentrated output of Black intellectual achievement from a single institution in the nation's history. Howard's location in Washington, D.C., the city where federal power is exercised and federal policy is made, gave its law school graduates immediate proximity to the courts and agencies where civil rights law was being argued and decided, a geographic advantage that Howard's legal faculty leveraged with a deliberateness that produced the legal strategy behind Brown versus Board of Education. Number 9. The U Street Corridor was Black Broadway. U Street Northwest, the commercial and entertainment corridor in the Shaw neighborhood that was the center of Washington, D.C.'s Black cultural life from the 1920s through the 1950s, was called Black Broadway because the concentration of theaters, jazz clubs, restaurants, and night spots it contained rivaled Harlem as the most culturally productive Black neighborhood in America. Duke Ellington was born 3 blocks away, Pearl Bailey and Ella Fitzgerald performed on its stages, and the Howard Theater anchored a block of entertainment that the legal segregation of the rest of Washington, D.C. had inadvertently created by concentrating Black talent and Black audiences in the same geography. The 1968 riots that followed Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination devastated U Street commercially and demographically, a destruction from which the corridor spent 30 years recovering before a revival. Beginning in the 1990s, produced the restaurant and nightlife district that now occupies the same blocks, newer and more expensive and populated largely by people who arrived after the history that made it significant. Number 8. The Kennedy Center sits above the Potomac. The John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts opened in 1971 on a site on the Potomac Riverbank that had been proposed for a national cultural center since the Eisenhower administration and stalled until Kennedy's assassination created the political will to finally build it, is the busiest performing arts facility in the United States, presenting over 2,000 performances annually in its opera house, concert hall, and theater to audiences totaling approximately 3 million people, making it more productive by performance count than Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, or any other comparable institution. The center is a federal memorial to Kennedy, which means it receives federal maintenance funding but charges commercial ticket prices, an arrangement that has kept it solvent while other performing arts institutions have struggled. And that would have appealed to Kennedy's particular understanding that the best memorials are ones that stay open. Number 7. Arlington National Cemetery contains the country's grief. Arlington National Cemetery, established in 1864 on the confiscated estate of Robert E. Lee, seized by the Union government when Lee failed to pay his property taxes in person as required by a wartime act that was designed specifically to result in forfeiture, covers 639 acres across the Potomac in Virginia, and contains over 400,000 graves of American military personnel, including John F. Kennedy, whose eternal flame marks a hillside with a view of Washington that Kennedy had admired from the spot weeks before his assassination. Approximately 30 funerals take place at Arlington daily, and the cemetery is projected to reach capacity for traditional in-ground burial within the next decade, a logistical reckoning with the size of the country's military history that the cemetery's administrators are managing with a care proportional to what the ground contains. Number 6. The city's Black majority built a distinct culture. Washington, D.C. has been a majority Black city since 1957, a demographic fact that shaped one of the most distinctive urban cultures in America. Go-go music, the percussion-driven funk genre developed by Chuck Brown in the 1970s and unique to D.C., is the official music of the district by act of the D.C. Council, a designation that represents the city's assertion of a cultural identity rooted in its Black majority rather than its federal monuments. The tension between the D.C. that the federal government built and the D.C. that its residents built has defined the city's politics, its neighborhood geography, and its relationship to gentrification, a process that has displaced significant portions of the majority black neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River, while the property values driven by federal employment and tech sector growth push relentlessly in their direction. Number 5. Pennsylvania Avenue connects power to ceremony. Pennsylvania Avenue, the diagonal boulevard connecting the Capitol to the White House that L'Enfant designated as the nation's main street, has been the route of presidential inaugurations, victory parades, state funerals, and protest marches for over 2 centuries. A corridor of federal buildings, hotels, and monuments that functions simultaneously as the most politically charged street in America, and as a tourist promenade where people eat at food trucks within sight of the Department of Justice. The avenue was largely a commercial strip of struggling businesses and adult theaters until a Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation was established in 1972 and spent 20 years rebuilding it into the ceremonial boulevard it was supposed to be. A public investment so successful that it erased the street's interim history so completely that most visitors assume it always looked the way it looks now. Number 4. Rock Creek Park is the city's wild interior. Rock Creek Park, the 1,754-acre national park running through the northwest quadrant of Washington, D.C., from the Potomac River to the Maryland border, is the largest urban national park in the United States and one of the least known. A forested valley of hiking trails, horse paths, a planetarium, and a working grist mill operating within 4 miles of the White House, visited regularly by the city's residents and largely undiscovered by the millions of tourists who exhaust themselves on the mall without knowing that an actual forest is a 15-minute drive away. The park's existence in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country is the result of an 1890 Act of Congress that set the land aside before development pressure could consume it, a foresight that the district's residents have been benefiting from for 130 years in the form of an urban wilderness that costs nothing to enter and nothing to maintain a relationship with. Number 3. The Embassy Row culture made D.C. international. Massachusetts Avenue NW, the stretch of grand mansions and purpose-built embassy compounds between DuPont Circle and Observatory Circle known as Embassy Row, houses more than 40 foreign embassies in a concentration that makes a single mile of Washington, D.C. the most diplomatically dense geography in the United States. A corridor where the flags of nations at war with each other fly on the same block, where intelligence services of competing powers maintain legal official presence within walking distance of each other, and where the social calendar of Washington's diplomatic community produces a parallel city of receptions, state dinners, and formal occasions that operates largely invisible to the tourists a mile away on the mall. The embassies themselves, many of them former Gilded Age mansions built by industrialists who could afford Massachusetts Avenue in 1900 and whose descendants could not afford to maintain them by 1950, contain some of the finest private architecture in Washington, open to the public one day a year during the Passport DC Embassy Tour. When the city gets its one annual opportunity to see the inside of buildings it has been walking past for decades. Number 2. The city's restaurant scene reflects the whole world. Washington, D.C.'s restaurant culture, long dismissed as a city where politicians ate expense account steakhouses and lobbyists ate whatever the client preferred, has transformed over the past 2 decades into one of the most genuinely diverse and sophisticated dining cities in the country, driven by the Ethiopian community in Adams Morgan and Columbia Heights that made D.C. home to more Ethiopian restaurants than any city outside Addis Ababa, the Vietnamese community along Eden Center in nearby Falls Church, and a generation of chefs who arrived in Washington for government-adjacent careers and stayed because the restaurant scene gave them a reason. The city's diversity of diplomatic, immigrant, and international professional communities means that cuisines represented in Washington include countries whose restaurants exist almost nowhere else in America, a culinary geography that reflects the city's role as a place where the entire world maintains a permanent presence, and where that presence has, as it always does, produced extraordinary food. Number 1. Washington, D.C. is where America decides what it believes. The final and most defining fact about Washington, D.C. is that this city, planned on paper before a single permanent building stood on its ground, built by enslaved labor on land carved from 2 slave states, designed as the physical expression of democratic ideals by people who owned other people, contains within its 68 square miles the full, unresolved argument of American history, conducted daily in its courts and its Congress and its streets and its monuments, and has been doing so for over 2 centuries without reaching a conclusion, because the argument is the point. Every march that came to the mall, every law debated in the Capitol, every president who stood on the steps of the building George Washington asked a French engineer to imagine, they all arrived at the same city that was designed for exactly this purpose. A capital whose architecture announces that the country it represents is still being built, still being argued over, still being made into something closer to what its founding documents promised, in a place that was always intended to be less a finished city than a continuous statement of intent. Now that you know these 25 facts about Washington, D.C., tell us which one surprised you the most. Drop it in the comments, and let's keep exploring the hidden stories of every American city together. Also, if you made it to the end and really enjoyed this video, go ahead and hype this video. It really helps grow my channel. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.